Hey readers, Casella here. Before we start, three quick things. First off, if you didn't know this about the show, we try to make these accessible even if you haven't read the book in question, but we also don't worry too much about spoilers. So if that is a thing you live in fear of, read the book first. Second, this episode, for me, was a bit of damned if I try, damned if I don't, probably worse for the former in terms of Spanish names and places. I think I caught the worst, but probably a few instances of my bad 6th grade Spanish class accent slipped through. Apologies. Lucky it wasn't my 10th grade French, to be honest. And lastly, A Meal of Thorns and the Ancillary Review of Books would really appreciate your support. Reviewing or just sharing episodes helps us immensely, and throwing a couple bucks a month at our Patreon would really help us move towards our next cool thing. Okay, that's it. Enjoy the show. A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Hello and welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ancillary Review of Books. I'm Jake Brookins. We look at arguably speculative fictions and ask critics, scholars, writers, and fans to expound on what makes them interesting, what they say about the field, and about the world. Today we're talking about Michael Zapata's novel, The Lost Book of ADANA Moreau, and we're joined by Dr. Maia Gillity. Maia is the Fanny Gaston Johansson Assistant Professor of Latinx Studies at Johns Hopkins, a Vice President on the motherboard of the Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present, and she's an editor for the Label Me Latina/O and Paul Graves SFF, a new canon series, a series, by the way, that we are big fans of at the ARB. She's founded and served on Latinx committees with the Modern Language Association and the Latin American Studies Association, and is the creator and curator of the scholarly and Fannish resource site, The Zombie Archive. Her first book, Doom Patterns, Latinx Speculations, and the Aesthetics of Violence, was published this year by Duke University Press. Maia, thank you so much for joining. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing okay, as we were saying in the before time, with the giant caveat that we are saying this in 2025 with lots of horrible things going on. But other than that, doing pretty okay.
Exactly. If you ignore the trash fire that is the world, everything is
Yeah.
going
hmm
well.
My phone ran out of power the other day, and like 2 hours later, I was like, why am I in such a good mood? What?
Like this is the best thing that's ever happened
Yeah,
to me.
didn't
You
look
don't
at it for
get
a second.
notifications every
hmm
5 seconds of
Yep.
another horrible thing.
Yeah. So before we jump into the last book of Adana Moreau, I was curious if there's anything else interesting you've been reading or working on you want to talk about.
Totally. This semester, I'm teaching my first grad seminar I've taught, and it's called Race Aesthetic Speculation. And I, on purpose, assigned, I think, 95% of the books that we're reading I haven't read before, and
Okay.
because they've been on my list for a long time,
hmm
or some, that I'd read maybe 10 years ago and wanted to revisit. So sort of cool stuff that I hadn't read before that I'm kind of intrigued by. And we just read Tender as a Flesh, the
Mm-hmm.
Agustina Basterrica novel, which is both sort of disgusting and fascinating.
Mm.
We just read Pink Slime
Oh, cool.
by Fernanda Trias, which
Mm-hmm.
I'm really intrigued by. And those are, I think, the two things that sort of are standing out to me. I'm teaching tomorrow. I'd read it before, but sort of revisiting it now. Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about it as both, this like pastoral novel, coming of age, but also really disturbing and sad about sort of, not spoiler alert, but
Right.
these clones that are
Yeah.
sort of there to give donations.
I never thought about putting that alongside the best Tereka, but that kind of rhymes in some interesting ways.
Yeah, I mean, I'm realizing that so much of the course, we read Whitehead's Zone One, and we're reading Beloved a couple weeks from now. But just thinking about sort of how bodies, especially like women's bodies, are mobilized in these texts, and
Mm.
I think a lot of them have to do with food and consumption in different ways. And I
Mm-hmm.
think even the way that I sort of organize the course, I hadn't thought of the way that they're functioning in
Mm.
these other ways together. So it's been cool to, I don't know, to read them in sequence and sort of think about new ways of thinking about the texts.
Oh, that's cool. That's really cool. I'm reading, I did not plan this, I swear, to line up with our discussion today, but I'm reading Hurricane Season, Fernanda Melchor.
I haven't read that yet, but it's on the list for the course too. And
Oh
I'm
my gosh.
there. I've heard it's really disturbing.
It is, but it's also just it. I haven't read anything that has just hit me as such a powerhouse of writing in a while.
Oh, wow.
I got I don't know if you know Indra Das is a science fiction fantasy author. He had just been kind of raving about it online a little bit, and I was like, oh, it sounds like I need to get this. And it's each chapter is like one unbroken paragraph, and the sentences are very long as well. So it just has this astonishing propulsive power where you just it's almost like you almost feel like you're in a panic. You're just kind of like going along and you can't stop.
Oh,
There's no place to take a breath, and you're just getting all this information. Yeah,
that's fascinating.
just started that, but it's really, really good. It's making me think a little bit. Do you happen to know Brennan Shea Basham's "Swim Home to the Vanished"?
I don't.
Came out a year or two ago. That's like this kind of magical realist novel about this. It's about this chef who's in mourning for his brother, and he goes to this sort of like village where everyone is turning into animals, including him. And it also has this like sort of weird looming ecological disaster, but it's very, very, very in the background, but like big.
That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I happened to like I kind of pulled it out of the reviewer assignment hat a year or two ago for Locus, and it's I've been thinking about it ever since. Really, really poignant.
Where's the author from?
I want to say Arizona. I want to say he's a Dene author,
Huh.
and the novel is also about witches a lot, which also lines up with the hurricane season. So
That's very cool. I mean, because, the way that I was, oh yeah, here it is. Cool. I'm gonna put this on my list. This is awesome. Because I just been thinking about, hurricane season, Tender as a Flesh. There's the other sort of horror Argentinian author, Melchor, Our Share of Night, a big novel. I don't know, just thinking about how obviously Fernanda Trias, the ecological disaster is so forefront, but I don't know that somehow they're all thinking about the aftermath of the dictatorship in Argentina and like
mm-hmm.
turning to this horror and gore and ecological disaster even to think about them and like why is it that the violence of history is sort of in the background while all this is foreground. It'd be interesting
Mm-hmm.
to think about it in relation to, yeah, Dene history and what does that
Mm-hmm.
mean for, I don't know, thinking about sort of like hemispheric.
Yeah, it does a really interesting job of like part of it feels very modern and part of it feels very out of time. And it doesn't quite locate where it is on the Southwest. So it has this sort of kind of like cultural ambiguity to it as well. That's really interesting. So yeah, highly recommended.
That's very cool. Yeah, I mean, that's something that one of my students was saying about, I guess, both Tender as a Flesh and Pink Slime, that they couldn't really figure out if it was supposed to be, a future
Mm,
or our future, near or far, or if it was an alternate history that these
mm-hmm,
texts were trying to examine. So it's like this like weird out of placeness where technology is sort of familiar and yet also kind of un sort of yeah, sort of untimed
mm-hmm.
somehow.
This is probably like a bigger discussion. Well, I don't know. Maybe we'll get into a little bit with the alternate world thing. But I've been thinking a lot about in like larger conversations of sort of like core, definitely science fiction, like science fiction, science fiction, science fiction, about the move from what is a plausible future as like a reader to oh okay this is a fantasy, right? And like there's this point if you think about science fiction from like the 50s or earlier where this idea that like of course we'll go out and we'll colonize the moon and we'll colonize all these planets and we'll do all this stuff in space and it'll be easy and great, where that's sort of like a reader reading it at that time you can understand that being kind of plausible. But then as time goes on that gets less and less plausible, right? The more we learn about how this stuff works. And just thinking about that, how do we avoid as readers using speculative fiction as a distancing thing and saying
Mhm.
like oh no this is in some future or this is some fantasy we could never get to. And when
Right.
you get that sort of ambiguity of like I don't know maybe it could be now if things were a little different, it gets much more uneasy to read in I think a way that's productive.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's interesting. I mean, I think my initial reaction would be to say that sort of, yeah, sort of in that Jamesonian way of, science fiction is here to make us reflect on our own present
Mm-hmm.
becomes much harder when it feels like it's not science fiction, it's reality.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I guess on the other hand, I would say that, there's some, and I think part of my own research is interested in thinking about how the speculative actually allows us to see the ways in which history for particular populations is actually speculative
Mm.
already. That
Mm-hmm.
sort of like, to be Latinx or to be a person of color actually means that you've gone through many apocalypses,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of that, being your own being is a speculative
Mm-hmm.
enterprise already, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
No, totally. Huh. Well, that's a good point to jump into the last book of Donna Moreau.
Yeah.
Let's get into it. So this book by Michael Zapata, it was published by Hanover Square Press in 2020. It showed up on a lot of Best of the Year lists, and it won the Chirby Award for Best Fiction. Shout out to the Chicago Review of Books. It's a braided novel. The whole timeline stretches over a century. Much of the narrative takes place in New Orleans and Chicago, but there's threads reaching other places around the globe. One of its central figures is Adana Moreau, who is a Dominican immigrant to the U.S., who becomes a science fiction writer in the 1920s. And the other anchoring character is Saul Drower, an Israeli American living in Chicago, who in 2004 discovers an unpublished manuscript by Moreau in his grandfather's effects, and he begins a journey to deliver it to her son. And the novel jumps back, forth, and sideways in time, revealing bits of the lives of the families involved, and it also has extended summaries of Moreau's speculative fiction, although interestingly, never directly. We never get like the text itself. It's always people talking about it. But yeah, I was really curious why you picked this book, and reading Doom Patterns. I was really fascinated to see it pop up in the introductions, and it was kind of in the back of my head as sort of a framing mechanism for some of the other things you were talking about.
So, and I think that's exactly and thank you for reading the book, and also thank you for saying that, because I think, for a long time I had sort of played around with how to start my own book and sort of different anecdotes to get me into thinking about my own hermeneutic, which is doom patterns, right? This like repeating or things that return readers again and again to these moments of historical destruction that are also pleasurable. And a friend of mine had been reading the Lost Book and said, "Oh, you have to read this
Mm,
because it's exactly what you're talking about. There's a way in which the novel is performing its own theory as it's being
mm-hmm,
unfolded, and sort of the how the novel is so beautifully concerned with cataclysms that keep returning and that connect people across time and space. And so I think that was my entry point to it, sort of just reading it for function for my own work.
mm-hmm,
And, and then I started teaching it, and, undergraduates just, I don't know, they love it. The book is
mm,
it's so beautifully written. I find it so moving and complicated in a way that I think on a first pass it might be maybe not easily dismissed, but I think that, sort of I just reread it because I taught it again this year. And I think there's so much there that on each rereading you find,
mm-hmm.
yeah, you find stuff again and again and again, which is, I think, at least my favorite part of rereading.
Yeah. Reading it reading it this time, I was one of the things I was struck by was that from afar the outline of this book looks like a kind of like stereotypical attempt to do like a great American novel, right?
Yeah.
But the execution isn't like that. And one of the things I was thinking about it a lot is this is a novel that is very much about like personal and familial heritage, right? And the sort of like obscured histories. But it's not doing it in some sort of tidy, neat, like, oh, we're all part of this wonderful tradition. Oh, we're all situated. And so much of it, I don't want to say is anchored, but like the kind of the points in the constellation of these stories are all people who are refugees, they're exiles, they're orphans.
Hmm.
And so much of it is about the poignancy of not being able to fully put yourself back in that history, right? And like Saul realizing how much about his grandfather he doesn't know and won't know, even though he
Hmm.
has this wealth, and like his or his grandfather being a historian and being a journaler, and having all these letters and tapes and things he can go back to. That's more than most people get. But even so, realizing like I'm not going to know the whole of it, and sort of doing both of those at once, this sort of like really intense loving interest in where people come from and how they led to you, and also this sort of awareness of the limits of being able to do that I just found really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think, I totally agree. And there's a sense that both there's a deep desire to know while also coming up against the fact that you just can't, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
where these like small little nodes of possibility in the same way that in the novel, right, all these alternate universes can lead you to these different places without necessarily getting to the, quote unquote, original one. And I think that in the novel itself, right, these like little moments of, there's like that little anecdote of the doctor who used to be a child, mine worker.
Oh my
And this,
gosh, yeah.
the story of the donkey.
Mm-hmm.
There's like the story of I think it was a Ukrainian woman, right, in the bar who's like
Mm-hmm. Or
fighting
Prussian, yeah.
oppression, yeah.
Yeah, uh-huh.
But there's like all these like little sort of anecdotes or moments of interconnection between people that are not fully explored.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's part of exactly what you're saying, that it's about the way in which interpersonal relationships are larger than history, and yet that there's no way to encapsulate the entirety of a person's story because we cannot know
Mm-hmm.
everything. And, I don't know, I was talking to my students about how heartbreaking that end is, right? That Maxwell
Yeah.
will never know his father's
Mm-hmm.
death, and that we're somehow allowed into it. And yet even that little sort of moment doesn't fully describe
Yeah.
the father, the relationship, the moment of his death. I don't know. It's like such a beautiful way to end
Mm-hmm.
that book.
I remember, so I read this while I was living in Chicago and knew a lot of people who read it and talked about it with a lot of folks. And I remember a number of people being like thrown by the ending and sort of,
Mhm.
wounded by it. And thinking about it this time, so that to people who haven't read this, one of the mysteries in the books is where one of the key figures, Maxwell Murrow, who's Adana's son, spends all this time sort of just traveling around as a teenager and a preteen looking for his dad in the, I guess, the 30s, the 40s.
Mhm.
And you just don't know what happened to his dad. And then the coda reveals what happens. But almost everything else we get in the novel sort of enters into the record, where like the record is basically Saul's awareness, right? Like where he sort of learns most of what we get in the novel. But nobody learns that. That coda is kind of like just for us.
That's for us, yeah.
And this kind of gesture at all of the things that history doesn't record, and the people who die from violence and the people who die alone, and just their stories don't go to us, but they did
Mhm.
happen. They are out there. It's such an affecting little ending.
Totally. No, and that ending is kind of like that jawbone, right? That woman carries
Mm,
in her car,
mm-hmm,
right? That, it's somebody's son that got disappeared, and she found this remnant,
mm-hmm,
and yet right, it's sort of just for her, just for us, and that you can't, right? It doesn't actually describe the whole of the
mm-hmm,
story. And I guess you have to make do with that fact.
mm-hmm. The way that this novel is sort of built off and around quite a few different large scale tragedies, right, and disasters and genocides without quite it doesn't quite center them in a way that would feel, I don't know, I don't want to say like appropriating or like sensationalizing them, but like the Holocaust is part of this, right? And Operation Condor is part of this, and the Pinochet regime is part of this. And like all of these different things around the world play into these characters' lives. That opening bit with the mining just for me resonates for the whole reading. So just this
Mhm.
this idea of this mining pony being kind of like, it reads as like this just like so unbelievably cruel, unbelievably violent thing, and then with this little twist at the end of like, oh, if the pony can do it, then a little boy doesn't have to, and so it becomes this weird sacrificial violence
Mm.
that echoes all through it. Yeah, I don't know quite what to make of that and to make of like this novel's relation to all these tragedies, but it's just kind of fascinating how each character is sort of tied to all these other points in history and just sort of informing why they are where they are and who they are in this way that's fascinating.
Yeah, and in a way, I think I like the way that that you're framing that as that, these huge historical events that are incredibly violent are sort of not centralized, especially not in a hokey way,
Mm-hmm.
that they're the catalyst for so much of the characters and how they become interconnected. In a way, it's kind of like what Saul's grandfather says, right? That history isn't about, right, it's about people and
Mm-hmm.
about their lives and about these, moments of connection. And I think it's also related to this question of that Saul and his friend Javier, who's a journalist, bring up about the way in which we're so fascinated by cataclysm and by
Mm-hmm.
disaster and how we sort of return to it again and again. And right, I think Javier says that we're addicted to disaster
Yeah.
somehow, that our own, and I think in a way it's like raising questions about the reader themselves, right? It's like, what is it our own titillation or fascination or desire to see this violence and how that becomes a way for, marketing books or
Mm-hmm.
marketing vision, and that it's both the writer feeding it to us and that we're sort of again, demanding these kinds of stories
Mm-hmm.
over and over again.
Yeah, I was thinking, I want to say it was Maurice Kreisman. Ooh, I might have the wrong, that might be the wrong author. Someone recently had a really great article about sort of like, I don't remember the term they used, but basically like Holocaust schlock, like sort of like quickly produced novels that just trade on some historical atrocity without really doing much genuine with them, but like people will buy it because it's like, it's this real big thing, so it sort of adds this, I don't know, kind of adds this. It's this cheap way to add significance, and not to say there's not like real ways to use
Mhm,
them for
mhm.
significance. But I want to ask you. I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but one of the things about doom patterns you talk about. Oh, I wrote down the line. You talk about the juxtaposition of catastrophe with pleasurable and fantastical worlds,
Yes.
which is something I'm very interested in. That I'm very interested in speculative fiction trading on cinematic death as a way to make itself interesting.
Mm.
But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about later in the book. You talk about not an anti-reparative approach, but sort of like a non-reparative way of reading these, of not reading a novel about the history of violence in Central America and trying to get a message of community and hope out of it, but just reading it and like that there is a pleasure there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Totally. Yeah. I think, as a Latinx literature scholar, I think the thing that I continue to see is the way in which we demand particular forms of political imperative and social justice and political repair from minoritized authors, right? That
Mm,
somehow, Latinx and Black novels or Asian American novels have to be overtly political and political for the purpose of community building or social justice.
mm-hmm,
And, I think it's a burden that's a little bit too demanding and, not necessarily something that's fair to ask of authors or of books even, right? To sort of like
mm-hmm,
change the world for the better. And I think the other thing is part of me, or part of my argument is that Latinx texts, on the one hand, this sort of the repetition of violence and the continued return to historical violence actually shows how the things that we think are realist are actually speculative in nature,
mm-hmm,
right? That this excessive violence should be read through a speculative lens. And at the same time, kind of like this, the last book of Adana Moreau, it's incredibly beautiful, right? The descriptions are
mm-hmm,
beautiful, the story is beautiful, and yet somehow at the end, right, we're left with this, not with, I mean, it's not even about not a complete picture, right? But there is this juxtaposition and this paradox we're left with. Like, how can we reconcile all this violence that is both, that is aesthetically pleasurable,
mm-hmm,
moments in the book that are funny and touching and moving in these ways that shouldn't be, right? That we shouldn't read these moments of violence in a way that is pleasing for us. And
mm-hmm,
yet it is, right? The fact that, I teach it in my classes, the fact that it's gotten all these awards or that it's, on these best lists, right? That itself is telling us that there's something that is hitting a nerve or hitting
mm-hmm.
something in the zeitgeist that we sort of want to keep returning to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking reading this particularly So we haven't even talked about that. There's a big section of this that is about Hurricane Katrina, right? And searching for Maxwell Moreau in the aftermath of this quote unquote natural disaster, and also the the bureaucratic administrative kind of nightmare that followed it. But I was just thinking about the way this often occurs to me. It occurs to me reading speculative fiction, but it occurs to me in real life of the kind of guilty fascination for natural disaster. Like when you look at a weather map and you see that freaking hurricane eye coming to the coast, and like you say out loud and you mean, gosh, I hope no one gets hurt. I hope it's not that bad. But deep down inside, no one is thinking, boy, I hope it fizzles out, right? Like everyone's thinking like, oh, it would be really wild if it were this giant, amazing thing, right? This like sort of, I don't know, pre-ethical desire for this sort of just cathartic, just giant, huge thing to happen has like a draw, I think that's part of why it's part of why we look back at, I don't know, horrible things in history that we all agree are bad, but they have this pull to it. And I think that's that some of it is the tragedy, some of it is the empathy, but I think there is kind of what you're getting at with the idea of like pleasures and violence, right? That there is something there that's just potent and just kind of, we go to that as readers.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm teaching a monsters class this semester, and I
Mm.
think part of my argument for monsters, I mean, I'm obsessed with zombies, and I think there's something there about both our desire to see bodies ripped apart and
Mm.
see things that shouldn't be happening at a safe distance, right? They're happening sort of over there, and we can participate and be voyeuristic about it. But we also put ourselves in both positions, right? What would it mean like to be torn apart?
Hmm.
What would it mean like to tear somebody apart or tear something apart? There's a fascination, a titillation, a form of release
Hmm.
that is both safe and right, all the lessons that monsters impart on us of, okay, you can't go into the woods and because it's, Jason's going to come kill you if you go do these sort of inappropriate things. But at the same time, it sort of allows us to experience those things
Hmm.
that are, quote unquote, forbidden.
It's a minor note in here, but do you have any thoughts on the zombies in Adana Moreau's fiction?
Oh man, I hadn't thought about them. I know that they, there's like there's a few references that keep appearing in the book within the book that we
Hmm.
never actually read. We just hear the synopsis of. There's the zombies, there's Simón Bolívar who keeps
Hmm.
appearing. My sort of very basic reading of it would be is because she's from the Dominican Republic and Haiti
Mm-hmm.
being the birth of the zombie in the Americas. I think that would be but I know. What do you think?
I'm not sure, and I spent a lot of this read thinking about. I love an ekphrastic object. I love a book that revolves around a fictional piece of art. I'm a sucker for it.
Totally.
Thinking about what this book does, and the way Zapata does a really good job of creating a framework and a background for this novel, and you can
Mhm.
picture it like we meet briefly like the publisher of like this doomed little science fiction
Yes.
press, and we get I think it might be a young Benjamin, right, who says like this is better than, I don't know, if, like August Derleth or whoever, like Clark Ashton Smith or H.P. Lovecraft, whoever he's comparing it to, right, and like situates it in this area,
Yes.
and like, and that there are other particularly women and non-white science fiction authors from this period who have often been suppressed or had
Right.
pen names or were writing under just the initials or something, and they're hard to rediscover. But it fits in there, and like I was thinking about C.L. Moore's stories,
Mhm.
very much so. For some reason, I have to go through and like line by line pull out a defense of this, but it has a Moebius feel to me, like Jean Giraud, the comic artist. Like it has that feel to me in some way. But I was thinking through this a lot, what the book is doing, because we're told it's very good, but we don't read it directly, right?
Right.
uh, because that is the problem with ekphrastic objects, is like if you actually presented the text to us, if it didn't impress us, we'd be like, wait a second, why
Right.
is it?
We totally like, why are you lying to us about how
Yeah,
good
right.
that is?
So instead, we just get secondhand reports of how good it is, so it works. But just thinking about what it's doing in here, and so the Lost Book of Adana Moreau is like not a speculative book,
Right.
but thinking about what this piece of speculation within it is doing, and I don't know, it's doing a lot, and but it's very ambiguous. The alternate worlds, the portals. So much of the Lost Book of Adana Moreau is this fantasy of moving between worlds, but it's
Mhm.
not a fantasy of moving to paradises. It's not a fantasy of utopian wonders.
Right.
There are fantastic things there, but it's often this sort of repeated, almost fractal story of refuge and exile and immigration and fleeing disaster and being chased by new horrors in the new place you're at. I don't totally know what to make of it, except that it mirrors many of the larger sort of biographies that are circling around the text in the book.
Hmm.
And I really don't know what to make, in a positive sense, of the alternate realities. And there's this point towards the end where I think it's Saul says that thinking about these alternate realities helps me make choices here.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I'm not totally sure what to make of it. Just like I'm not totally sure what to make of the fact that that Maxwell, her son, who becomes a physicist, is into all this alternate world physics stuff, which is kind of fascinating as a premise. But
Right.
like in reality, a lot of that stuff is like woo on the edge of new age, not going anywhere. Like not to, you know, some of it is, but a lot of it's just kind of like, okay, like this is like some like ancient aliens history channel kind of special. Not,
Right, right. Although, have you seen there's a new newish HBO Max show, Dark Matter, that's
oh,
that's all about this.
so this is really funny. I was going to bring up Dark Matter, but in a different direction. I forgot about the show. One of my praises for the Lost Book of Adana Moreau is that it gets Chicago so right.
Oh,
And I read this in a period where I was reading a bunch of books set in Chicago that were getting it so wrong. And
fascinating.
one of them is Blake Crouch's Dark Matter, which gets
Oh,
Chicago so
wow.
horrifically wrong.
That is fascinating. I mean, Zapata, I just interviewed him recently in a class, and
Mm,
he's, born, bred Chicago,
mm-hmm,
works, lives there. And I think the book itself is kind of not necessarily a love letter, but I think sort of takes Chicago really seriously
mm-hmm,
as a place. And totally as a side note, he's writing a book, and the book is titled, there's like a book within the book
mm-hmm.
here. And I think he's thinking about this as a trilogy. And the
Oh, okay.
second, I think it's about like a census taker
Mm,
in the Lost Book, and that's like the main character of the second novel. So it'll be interesting to see how kind of to come back to the alternate universes, how
mm-hmm.
those work in the three books that he's writing. I'll be curious to see that trilogy when it happens.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. But yeah, the alternate universe thing, I don't know. It's something I think about a fair amount because it's
Hmm.
such a common technique and trope now.
Right.
And I think, I mean, I'm not the first person to talk about this. Lots of people have talked about sort of multiverse fatigue
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
sort of realizing how, realizing as readers and as artists that having infinite possibilities is kind of draining. It's kind of exhausting. It sort of pulls meaning away from things when there's always another version of it.
Hmm.
And this is not doing that, but
No.
it is trying to think through like decision making along these alternate histories.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I like about the novel in terms of the alternate histories is that there's a way in which the lost or the books within the book are worried about these alternate worlds. Maxwell's own science and physics is worried about these alternate worlds. And then sort of the book itself, right? The Lost Book of Adana Moreau is presenting you all these alternate, or not, maybe not alternate, but these ways in which things that shouldn't be connected are somehow connected
Hmm.
through these portals, which are historical events, and these movements, exiles, people becoming orphaned. And I think, when Saul keeps thinking about how his parents were killed in that bus bombing in
Hmm.
Israel, and how, on the one hand, he could think again and again and again about the what ifs, right? Like
Right.
if his parents had lived and he had stayed in Israel, and all these possibilities. And at the same time, and on the inverse, all the ways that his parents would have died.
Hmm.
But at the end, right, he says it doesn't really matter, right? That I'm, I think in a way the novel is talking about sort of the happenstance of history and
Mm-hmm.
how all these things just happen outside of our control. And at the end of the day, what really matters is I am here now with you. We're having a conversation. We're having a moment of connection about things that matter, and that, sort of everything else obviously matters because it brought us here, but
Hmm.
what really matters is this interpersonal moment, and I think, like you said, like the decisions that we make from here on out.
Mm-hmm.
while at the same time we have to contend with all these things that are out of our control, all the things that we will never know, sort of. And I think, I don't know, what I like about the book so much is how it puts pain and pleasure or pain and beauty side by side without necessarily reconciling them.
Mm-hmm. It has Benjamin, Saul's grandfather, has what's I wrote down the line. It says history, like fiction, was illusory, if not an outright lie, but we still existed because of it, and it existed because of us. And this, his grandfather, I think they mentioned Studs Terkel, and it has a very like Terkel-esque approach to, you know, not exactly history, but almost like sort of canvassing in place of like
Mhm.
creating a linear narrative and just getting all these stories together. And yeah, think about this way that a lot of this book is about kind of rejecting master narratives,
Yes.
and trying to look at the broader and the like the concrete individuals that made up it. But it's interesting because it's also not. I think the a danger of that approach is sort of I don't know, trying to abstract us from the course of history and just making us sort of like victims of these larger forces. And
Mhm.
I don't think the book is doing that. Like particularly in Javier's case, like right, we see that like this person who is just a reporter but is also involved.
Yes.
And I think part of the book doesn't go hard on it, but one of the interesting threads about the Katrina section, right, is like seeing this recovery effort that is by and large not the historical account, right? And it's most of
Mhm.
the work not being, not being the soldiers that are there, not being the sort of official action, but just what are actually people doing on the ground? How are they ripping out the rot in these houses to hopefully save them?
Yeah, and like what are they cooking with and how are they
Yeah.
totally. Oh, I was just thinking too, right, that in a way the book is set up as Benjamin, Saul's grandfather's tapes, right? He's sort of going
Mm-hmm.
around recording all these people, and that these like little moments are a way for us to get sort of like little snippets of history. And no, I don't think people are victimized, but I think it is both about sort of large, uncontrollable forces and our own and the character's own interconnection and decision making
Mm-hmm.
within those forces and sort of having to deal with both at the same time.
Yeah, no, totally. And something I really like about it, and science fiction, speculative fiction as a genre in its sort of more traditional, triumphant adventure quest mode, really loves putting people in like those like cut and dry, you are like the moral actor at this critical juncture in history
Right.
kind of thing. And not that those situations never happen, but that most of history is more the kind of stuff that Benjamin's recording, right? Just all these people moving around, making choices as best they can.
Minutia. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
in a way, one of my students said that Saul was like the most boring character, that he
Ah,
was so like milquetoast in a lot of ways.
mm,
That he's just, he's going to work at his hotel, he's reading his, paperback science fiction novels, he's whatever, talking to his friend Javier, who has this very, bombastic, adventurous life. But in a way, I think that's just, I don't know, I don't, it lends a reality to it that somehow
mm-hmm.
he has to overcome his really boring circumstances and
Mm-hmm.
go to New Orleans and do all these sort of bigger than life things. And I just remember what I was going to say before, that somehow, that it is fully against this history as, as the West conceives it, and sort of these, whatever history is recorded in the archive. And I think there's a way in which it's putting history side by side with all the science fiction that ADANA Moreau's into, that Saul's into, as saying that there's another way to think about history
Mm-hmm.
through these science fictional texts
Mm-hmm.
that isn't necessarily the history that we think of as being, teleological and sort of, towards progress, if that makes sense.
No, I think that does, and that I think that ties into the idea that the portals that Adana is writing, and the kind of, you could call it escapist reading that Saul is doing, when he's reading science fiction, that they're not simply just visions of something better, that they're kind of sideways to the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a sense, there's when what she says to Maxwell on her deathbed, right? That sort of the Caribbean is the birth of everything, but
Mm,
it's also this place of of deep violence for her, right? Her parents are died in the US occupation. And so I think there's a way in which I don't know, the fact that the Lost Book of Adana Moreau is not science fictional, and we consider the text within the text science fictional in a way, I think she's just writing about the things that she knows best.
Yeah.
And we just think of it as science fiction
Mm-hmm.
because we tend to think of these fantastical things as
Mm-hmm.
that. But the things that happen to her in her life are fantastical themselves, right? Or they shouldn't be considered, quote unquote, normal.
Mm-hmm.
And even, the fact that the second book that Saul finds isn't actually the
Right.
lost book. It's a retelling, or it's a second retelling, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
Maxwell tells a story to Benjamin when they're children, and Benjamin writes it down for Maxwell. So it's sort of this third-hand account
Yeah.
of these fantastical things.
The book is doing something, what's the word for this? The way that the violence is such a foundation and a background to many of these threads, and the way that, yeah, Adana is taking that as just kind of bedrock for how her speculative fiction works. That, again, the book is not in your face with it, but as I was reading it, I was thinking about how Adana's parents being killed by U.S. Marines is 100%, it's not, she's a fictional character, but this is like 100% plausible to what actually
Mhm.
happened there. And that's not something that most Americans know about, right? And
Mhm.
the history of, U.S. efforts, directly or indirectly fueling violence is something that is fantastic for a reader who doesn't know about it. And the way that this sort of puts these facts in there and then sort of like, I don't know, kind of couches them in this slightly fantastic way, but having the contrast of the science fiction with the rest of the book, which is more kind of just like bedrock.
Mhm.
It does this odd trick of sort of like tensioning that a little bit and making me like, oh, like actually, this is real. Like what's going on in Argentina is real, and what happened in Prussia and in Israel. Like these are,
Mhm. Mhm.
it situates them against this more fantastic vision to kind of like remind you of their reality in an odd way.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to think about this book in relation to the Juno Diaz Brief Wondrous Life of
Mm-hmm.
Oscar Wilde, right? In
Mm-hmm.
which, the story itself isn't science fictional, and yet the novel is so concerned with science fiction as a
Mm-hmm.
leading principle. And there's all those little footnotes, right? There's a footnote in the beginning of for those of you who missed your lesson of Dominican history, and it gives you this like brief moment of US occupation and the Trujillo regime and all these things. And I think in a way, right, even in that novel, Oscar Wilde says, or Oscar de Leon says, who's more science fictional than us? Yeah, what is more science fictional than the Antilles? And I think there's a way in which, yeah, it's presenting for American audiences that don't know this history, these brief moments that you might want to sort of look into more, and also positioning it next to something that we very easily can see as being speculative or
Mm-hmm.
excessive, and saying, well, what happens if you look at history through this lens as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something that should be something that we consider normal should be sort of considered
Mm-hmm.
fantastical or sort of otherworldly.
Yeah, and I mean that comes up with Benjamin's interview with the bartender, right? And like who's Prussian, right? And getting in an argument about where she's from. But this idea that it's so easy to for another culture to erase and overlay the reality of these stories, but they're still down there.
Right, and that's what we
Yeah.
call history, right?
Right.
That
Yeah.
that gets put into the historical archive, but her Prussianness is
Mm-hmm.
totally erased
Yeah.
or put to the side.
Mm-hmm. But not for her. And so that
Right.
importance of sort of like holding on to that and kind of like shouting that story again. Yeah. I think this is a good time. Let's take a quick break. All right, we're back. I wanted to read just this paragraph or so about disaster, just because I dug it, and I think it's kind of one of the things the book is really doing. So I believe this is when Saul and Javier are in post-Katrina New Orleans outskirts. They're looking for Maxwell Moreau, but they haven't found him yet. And Saul is sort of reflecting on Javier's obsession, as he thinks about it, with disaster, and why Javier has kind of like chased various natural and human disasters around the world. Disaster as obsession or addiction, thought Saul. Disaster as a symptom of something uncanny at work in the world. The Lago Agrio oil fields in Ecuador, the Tepito neighborhood of Mexico City where Javier went looking for Marina and her sick patients, the collapsing financial center of Buenos Aires, the aftermath of the Great Deluge of New Orleans. Disaster as the infrastructure of the world, disaster as jet black liquid enveloping his skin like oil. Disaster as guilt, self-reproach for earning a salary from disaster, while in other places, other people with his same forehead, earlobes, teeth, skin, and voice were invisible, displaced from time and history, as if a 1,000-mile fog had settled over that southern continent. And I just really dug that, because that's Saul trying to figure out his friend, but it also feels a little bit of a diagnosis of what we, the reader, are doing. Right? And even though this novel, as you put it, just has this kind of MacGuffin. Well, it's sort of a double MacGuffin. It has like the MacGuffin of the actual physical book, and then it has the MacGuffin of Maxwell Moreau, where is he?
Right,
We got to
right.
find him. Even though it's doing that, so on the one hand, the plot of it is this fairly simple: go find a thing, take a thing to somebody. It's also chasing disasters in each of its timelines, right? Whether that's the disaster of Katrina, whether that's the disaster of the Great Depression, whether that's various military and political disasters around the world. That's sort of what every timeline is sort of following in some way. Yeah, I just found that kind of fascinating insight into what the novel thinks it's doing. I like what you said, that this novel sort of self-theorizes itself.
Right, right. I
Yeah.
think, yeah, this is like one of those meta moments, which I think the book is thinking about itself as participating in the propagation of disaster, and how readers are implicated in this system of, yeah, that we find it troubling and fascinating, and that we keep returning to these moments and the marketability of disaster, right? That we expect a Latinx author to, of course, write about violence. I don't think we
Mm-hmm.
expect it in this particular way. And the way in which that's a really real thing, that the world is organized in a lot of ways through violence and destruction on the very large and small scales that lead to exile, again, from
Mm-hmm.
mass movements to very small individual immigration or
Mm-hmm.
emigration. So yeah, I find this to be one of those sort of zooming out moments of thinking both about what the characters within the main plot are doing, what the Lost Book is doing, what the networks of exchange within the plot are doing, and then sort of the book as an object itself is doing within
Mm.
our hands and in sort of the larger market of literature.
This is actually finally making some things click up for me with how the alternate worlds and the sort of portals thinking go. Is just, a lot of times when you have a science fiction text that is thinking about either alternate dimensions, multiverses, alternate realities, or about time loop stories, they're a way to kind of think your way out of the situation you're in.
Hmm.
And like, well, what if just things were different? Like, what if the Aztecs had beaten off the Spaniards? What would have gone differently? What if this invention hadn't happened, or this person, what if baby Hitler got stomped by an elephant or whatever,
Right, right,
what
right.
would have happened? Like, that's interesting, and that's obviously like sort of one of the biggest tools in the science fictional toolbox, is thinking about those what if questions. But there's also this way that misses so much about history works, and how things actually happen, and how things are overdetermined a lot of times. And it's very, John Bar points, is that what they talk about? Where like, sometimes there's like a little linchpin in history, and if things go a little different, things go wildly different. But a lot of times, just tons of stuff is happening, and it's one of the reasons that the natural disasters feel like such almost a refutation of that theory. Because how do you stop a hurricane? Who do you go back and, what butterfly do you go back and shoot to stop a hurricane? There's just no way to know. And trying to think about using that almost, I don't know, like, yeah, like a refutation, using that inability to think of a way around an overdeterminacy as a more realistic way to think about our place in
Mhm.
history. I was thinking, reading this about other like portal and alternate reality things I've read recently, and there's a really good one, Amy Pokłatka's Self Portrait with Nothing.
Oh, cool. I don't know that.
Yeah, very very fun. I want to say it was a debut novel, but where that has, I won't get into it, but it has like a mechanism for alternate reality stuff. And but
Cool.
she, before she discovers that, has always been sort of mentally hung up on the idea that, well, in another universe, I'm successful because I did this. Like in another universe, like I did everything right in that universe, and I'm better than. She finds that sort of like hampering in the real world, and then finding this actual science fictional mechanism makes her kind of like realize the foolishness of that.
Mm.
I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about a lot of, Lavi Tidhar. I was thinking about a lot of his work, which often uses alternate realities. He has a book called The Circumference of the Earth, which is very much in parallel to this book in a weird way. But he has another one called Unholy Land, which it has this sort of like noir detective framework, but it gets very weird as you go on. But it's about alternate an alternate world where, instead of the state of Israel being established where it is today, it's established in, I want to say, like the Kenyan Ugandan border, which there had been like
Yeah.
Zionist
There have
discussion
been
of.
talks about it. Yeah.
Yeah, but the character starts sort of slipping between realities and basically starts seeing all of the different ways that the establishment of a state of Israel could and can and has gone wrong, like sort of across these different
Mhm.
realities. And it feels like this really interesting, sophisticated kind of critique of that kind of like national project, because it's thinking about all these different ways it could have played out and how like good intentions or bad intentions, regardless, when you have these huge giant moving pieces with all of these different cultures and peoples, to the way that can go wrong. This novel keeps flirting with this very speculative fiction idea, and then it keeps grounding itself again in people looking for their friend, people looking for their
Mhm.
father, people trying to find an 80-year-old retired physics professor in the chaos of a natural disaster.
Yeah.
And just sort of, yeah, grounding itself over and over again, rather than taking these kind of like, oh, if only I'd done this, oh, if only I'd
Mhm.
done that.
Well, and I think, yeah, you're totally right that I think part of it is saying like it doesn't matter, right? That's like we are here and it's
Hmm.
about, in a way when you were talking, I was thinking about we like to think of these incredibly spectacular moments in history, right? The Bolshevik Revolution, this like big explosion, Hurricane Katrina, big explosion, when really the novel is also concerned, with this what Rob Nixon calls slow violence, right? These things that
Mm-hmm.
happen, very slowly over time, and yet violence is happening
Hmm.
on at every instant. And I think part of it too is there's something kind of overwhelming about that. I think the book does a good job of showing how, if you stop to think about every single thing that's happening at every single moment and the connection of all these, spectacular and non-spectacular violences, it becomes really destabilizing and so overwhelming that, of course, it's easier to think of, oh, what if, what if, what if,
Hmm.
when really it doesn't necessarily matter. And I think it could be, these like really hokey, well, I explored all these other universes and I realized that my home is the place that I want to be, that
Mm-hmm.
kind of like my life is the best
Yeah.
one. When really this is saying, okay, sure, there's all these other possibilities, but violence is inevitable and exile is inevitable and orphanhood, there's a way in which yeah, like it keeps grounding us back to this moment. I don't know, I guess like the other text I would throw in here in sort of sophisticated alternate is Seshu Foster's Atomic Aztecs,
Mm.
which is sort of what if the Aztecs had not been defeated and they were, and now they're fighting. One world is set in 1942. The Aztecs are fighting with the Russians against the Nazis, and the other is set in this slaughterhouse in LA in what could be our time. And I think in a way it's saying it doesn't matter if the
Mm.
Aztecs would have beat the Spaniards because they just become another world
Mm.
empire. And right, so empire is inevitable, violence is inevitable. I don't know, there's a way in which it's sort of not pessimistic, but yeah, not hokey in a way that I find
Yeah,
kind of refreshing.
right. What else do we want to say about this novel? We talked about a couple things in the break.
Um, I don't know. I love this book. I
Mm-hmm.
find it to be really, really moving and kind of profound in a way that I think yeah, isn't cheesy or for all its erasure of the main female character, I find it to
Yeah.
be, I don't know, really, really beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, we were talking about this in the break that like compared to some of the texts that this is in lineage with, doing either violence or like literary complexity, that this in a way is sort of like an easy read.
Hmm. Hmm.
But then coming back to it, it does have these like layers, and the construction to it is really really interesting.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, like every time that I reread it, if I haven't read it in like a year and I teach it, I try to reread it again and I find that I find something new every
Mm-hmm.
time. Yeah, I love the way in which the form is mirroring itself.
Mm-hmm. And it has a kind of sweetness to it without being saccharine, which I think is that's a very narrow road to walk, and
Oh my
it does
God, I
it very
can't,
well.
I try to be a fiction writer for a minute when after,
Mm.
and I think it must be so hard to sort of not cross over into the schmaltzy,
Mm-hmm.
which this book I think could have been, but it's really not.
Oh, this is good. I'm really glad you brought this up. This was a fun book to come back to, and think about how it ties into
So
thing. And
glad.
yeah, and like I said, if listeners haven't picked this up, this ties together so many things interestingly, in speculative fiction and outside of speculative fiction, that I really like it.
And I mean, I think it's a fun read more than anything.
Hmm. Yeah, and it has like, especially I think it just has part of it. I think is obviously he's a fictional character, but Benjamin's approach to things feels like it just infuses the book of this kind of like very smart but very quiet kind of just tell me your story, and like has this sort of humor to it, and just I don't know, captures the kind of absurdity of that, like people are just walking around with all these weird things they've experienced, and they might tell you if you ask them.
It just occurred to me too that I think something that I like so much in some books is that you can tell that the author really loves his characters. And I think
Mm,
there's so much love for all their faults. I think there's so much love here for every single person in
mm-hmm.
the book.
Yeah.
And like respect. I think there's like respect, admiration, and care for
Mm-hmm.
every single person.
Mm-hmm. I love even with Maxwell, you don't get on the page terribly much. Like you get him as a kid, but you kind of
Mhm.
you don't really know what he's like as an adult. But just that you get that the nameless physicist who met him twice, right? He like meets him at the one
Right.
conference and meets him again, like immediately responds to Saul, like, "Hey, you found this guy? Like this guy really impressed me."
Yeah.
Like I don't know, this has this air of reality to it.
Yes.
And I love
Yes.
his relationship with it. Is it Victoria
With the woman who he met in the desert.
in the
Yeah.
desert who's doing the search for the remains? But just yeah, has this like this that they have like this romantic email exchange in their 80s and
Right,
then
right,
find each other.
right.
Like I think that's great. Yeah.
It's
Cool.
beautiful, totally.
Before we get going, is there anything you wanted to share about what you're working on or what's coming up next or where people can find you?
You can find me on Blue Sky,
Hmm.
Maya Giladi. Check out my book, just came out in January, Doom Patterns, Latinx Speculations, and the Aesthetics of Violence from Duke.
Could you give us, I didn't give you a chance. Could you give us just what's the elevator pitch for Doom
Oh
Patterns?
man, sure. Yeah, Doom Patterns is about depictions of violence in Latinx fiction and how reading through what I call the protocols of Latinx speculative fiction allow us to see both how excessive violence is otherworldly while also being pleasurable in many different ways. I think that would be the really sort of brief description of it. Yeah, it just came out. Hopefully people pick it up and
Yeah,
like it.
it's good. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Good
Thanks for
title too.
reading
Yeah.
it. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, yeah, this was wonderful. I think those are all our notes on this book.
This was so fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks again. A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Bartra Hari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabrielle Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. Thanks to our human transcribers, Kate Dollarhide and John W.M. Thompson. They are diligently working on getting us caught up on our transcriptions. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, that is rad. A few different ways you can do that. Join our Patreon. A couple dollars a month really moves us towards our sustainability and contributor paying goals. You can hang out with us on Discord, and we've got a couple other goodies in the works. If you're interested in a book we mention, buying from the bookshop link in our show notes or at the ARB website gets us a cut, and it helps us immensely if you just help get the word out about the show. Leaving us a review, commenting, or sharing on your platform of choice, that really helps. And it's nice to know you're listening. Questions, suggestions, pedantic notes about things we got wrong? Drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com, and you can follow us on Blue Sky for periodic skeets, I guess. Did that term stick? Next episode, Monday, June 2nd, 2025, critic and reviewer Rosanna Pendlebury is coming back on to walk us through this year's Hugo list, at least the fiction parts. We will be slinging some praise, slinging some dirt. We'll ponder the state of the field. It should be a good time. Until then, hope you're doing okay out there. Read critically. My father would say it's a good day to be a duck here. Not much else.
I'm gonna start using that. That's really good.